Hey, welcome back. And you know what? I'm always so glad that you are joining me today and lots of pastors around the world as we talk about things that actually matter, highly practical things that can change your church, change the trajectory of your mission. Today, I want to talk about something that I think a lot of pastors feel, but very few actually name out loud. And it is that slow, quiet drift that happens when financial pressure starts to reshape how a church talks about generosity, how financial pressure reshapes how we think and talk about generosity in the church. Here's because this is the truth, and I've seen this play out so many times. No church plans for this. No elder board sits down and decides that raising money will become now the new primary leadership missional focus. Like no pastor writes that into their vision statement, right? But it happens all the time, very gradually, subtly, kind of underneath the surface until one day you realize that most of your giving conversations are really budget conversations wearing generosity language. That's a pressure that a lot of you may be feeling. And listen, it's not a character failure. So let's be really clear about that. It's a design conversation. If it's a failure of any kind, it's just a design failure. And that's a difference. And what I love about design issues is that they're fixable. So let's talk about how this drift happens before we kind of start working on fixing it. When financial pressure builds, giving communication gets tactical really quick, doesn't it? You start talking about the gap, you lean harder into the asks that you're making, you make the case for why the church needs people to give right now, right? And sometimes that can work, at least maybe create a minimal spike in the short term, but it doesn't solve anything. So the pattern just keeps repeating short term issues with short term asks that begin to move the mission away from the actual mission. I mean, it only takes a few cycles of that before something shifts. And giving no longer is being presented as a discipleship opportunity. It's being talked about, presented as a ministry survival tool. And here's the thing, people can feel the difference even if they can't name it specifically. Like when the invitation to give sounds like a need, an institutional need, rather than a spiritual growth opportunity or formation opportunity. Something in the listener, in the congregation, shifts in a way that we don't really want to shift. And here's the deal, though, they may still respond, at least on some level, but what you're actually getting out of it is compliance, not formation. Let me say that again. When you talk about money that way, as a budget need, as an issue, as a problem to solve, and people move, you get a spike maybe in a little bit of revenue, but you're getting compliance, not spiritual formation. And those two things, they can look the same 6 months later because stuck people rarely leave dramatically. They just stop growing because they're not being challenged into spiritual formation. They're just being challenged to do something that helps the church, whether it helps them or not. And you know what happens with these people? They eventually stop helping the church because the church is not actually moving them. So let me give you a question that we can sit with for a minute. What is your church actually asking people to fund? When you talk about generosity, you talk about giving, what is your church actually being asked to fund? And if we're just gut level honest, just between you and me, is the primary kind of framing for this your budget? Is the language built around, and you would never say that out loud, but is that kind of what's sitting under, is it undergirding the conversation? Is the language built around, what the church needs financially? Because if that is true, you are not asking for generosity, you're asking for obligation. And obligation produces compliance. Formation produces generosity. And those are two very different postures, and they create two different outcomes. When giving is framed as spiritual growth, as a step in spiritual formation, the invitation is built around what happens in the life of the giver and not just what the gift accomplishes for the church or for the organization. In fact, the entire posture of the conversation changes. You're no longer pitching a need, you are naming an opportunity, a next step. And listen, that is not semantic differences, that is structurally different. It means the primary reason that you talk about giving is because it forms people. Remember, we're in the discipleship business, not the fundraising business. The budget benefit is real and it matters, and we're grateful for it. but it is downstream of the formation goal. When the goal shifts to growing people, the language of generosity moves and shifts with it. And what's ironic? The funding tends to follow suit, it tends to grow. In fact, churches that are constantly that consistently build durable generosity cultures are not the ones with the best campaigns and slogans or the most emotionally compelling asks and stories. They really are the ones that have made giving a normal, expected part of spiritual growth. It is just embedded in their discipleship pathway. And it's reinforced in their preaching, and it's modeled, by their leaders long before any financial needs are even surfaced. I mean, think about it this way. Generosity as formation, not fundraising. That's really the shift I would love for you to think about. Now, where do churches kind of miss this, right? Well, there's some things, right? Churches try to change the Sunday morning ask without ever examining what is being said, internally. And that internal frame, right, that we've talked about is where the real issue lives. So think about, just for example, think about your last 3 leadership conversations around giving. It could be, one-on-one coffee, or it could be from the stage in a vision inspiration moment, whatever. It could have been in a series or a sermon, just whatever it is. So just seriously, just for a second, think about that thing. The last couple of conversations, 3 leadership conversations around generosity. And if you, again, just between you and me, if you had to be honest, what was the frame for those? What was the framing around them? How much do we need to raise? Was that the question in the back of your head? Are we going to make budget? Was that what you were thinking? What are we going to do if giving doesn't improve? They're not necessarily bad questions. If the financials are not well, right, if it's unhealthy, we need to figure out how to get financially healthy. But if they are the only questions that we are asking when we talk about generosity, that internal frame, if it's entirely financial, the external communication is going to reflect all of that. And you can't really speak formation language from a fundraising posture. Like it doesn't work that way. Leaders, say what they believe, and what they believe leaks through everything eventually. So if you were to make a change or a thought or a move this week, here's what I would encourage you to do. Just audit your kind of internal generosity language before, don't even look at everything externally. Just think internally for a minute about your generosity language. Or like we said earlier, pull those last 3 leadership team conversations about giving and just look at the framing of them. Was it budget gap or discipleship growth? What was the focus? Was it financial pressure or spiritual formation? If the frame is primarily institutionally or an institutional need, really that is the shift to make first. And I would love for you as a group, decide together, like in your next lead conversation, lead team, lead volunteer, elder conversation, that generosity is a discipleship conversation. And start treating it that way in every single internal conversation. And that will affect how you talk about it on Sunday. And then the next step would be to let the external communication follow really from that conviction of the internal conversations. And again, not from the calendar or from the budget, not from the quarterly shortfall, but from the way you see it internally. The giving culture that you want on Sunday starts, ironically, in the staff meeting on Tuesday. That is the sequence. And getting that sequence right has the potential to change a lot of things downstream. Now, you probably don't need me to tell you this, but if we don't change how we think about this, that internal frame is going to stay budgetary. That generosity culture is going to stay fragile. And you're going to raise money, but you're going to do it in waves, and you'll do it around campaigns and urgent needs and spikes and around emotionally charged appeals. And what you'll do is you'll spend significant leadership energy kind of managing the anxiety between the waves. And you know what? More importantly, your people, they're not going to grow spiritually because of that. They're not going to experience the formation that can come through genuine discipleship grounded generosity. And you're going to keep working harder to produce giving from the people who were never actually invited into it as a spiritual practice. And that's a leadership cost. And you're going to keep paying that tax, right, long after any sort of campaign or emotional ask ends. The mission that you are trying to fund, it really does deserve a generosity culture built around it. not one that just accidentally, subtly, slowly replaces it. So do the audit this week, right? Pull those conversations in, name the framing that you've been using, and make the internal shift first. That's where it starts.